Hello, Red Dead listeners. This is your host, Kirill Zubovsky. Today, my guest on the show is David Heinemeier Hansson. David is an author of a best-selling book called Rework. He's also a race car driver. And for the last 15 years, David and his co-founder Jason have been running a company called Basecamp. David is a really outspoken person, and he focuses a lot on living a life, a happy life, a fulfilling life, a successful life. But unlike many people, he lives a successful life as defined by himself and nobody else. This, and how his entrepreneurial journey led him to define a philosophy for his life and how he's applying that while raising his two young children, is what we're going to talk about on the podcast today. Without further ado, David, welcome to the show. You know, Basecamp's been around for almost 15 years, and you've been doing Rails and Basecamp together for this long. What drives you? You know, why do you still show up for work?
That's a good question. I think it's especially a good question once you've reached the point in your professional career, or at least I've reached the point in my professional career where I don't have to go to work, right? We've been so fortunate with the success of Basecamp that I could stop doing that and either start something else, start another company, or just do open source or spend my time on any other pursuit. So it is a question I ask myself pretty frequently as a way of gauging whether we're heading in the right direction with Basecamp. Because given the fact that neither Jason nor I need to do Basecamp, we should do Basecamp because we want to. And that revolves a lot around actually ensuring that things stay within the realm of allowing us to do our favorite things most of the time. For me, that means programming a lot. I love to program. It's one of my favorite things. As far as hobbies, pursuits, passions go, it's probably, if not my favorite thing in the world, it's close to it, or it shares that spot with a few other things. So I want to be able to keep doing that, right? So we've decided that Basecamp should be a place that allows me to keep programming and Jason to keep designing, and both of us to keep writing and teaching and sharing, and not, for example, spend all our time growing the company, so to speak. We earlier this year, or was it late last year? I forget, announced that we were going to do a hiring freeze. Basecamp is about 53 people right now, and that's a good size where you don't need a whole layer of middle management and then managers for those middle managers. And we wanted to avoid that transition, right? Not that we thought that we were particularly special, in fact, because we thought that we were not. That if we continued on the growth path that we were on and hiring slowly but steadily more people, we would reach a breaking point where all of a sudden we would need to spend most of our times doing our not favorite things all the time, right? Just managing and running the company, which is rewarding in its own sense, but it's not the same as spending your time creating with your own two hands. So that's pretty much the ethos, to stick with the things that we like, right? Because if I were to stop doing Basecamp, for example, I would still want to program, would still want to write. So can't we just find a way to accommodate those desires, passions, pursuits within the Basecamp that we already built up? That is the successful company where I get to work with some of the best people I've ever worked with in my life to pursue a mission that I find completely worthwhile and still engaging on a application that I use for many hours every day. That sounds like a pretty good deal to me.
That sounds like what a lot of people are striving for day in and day out, and perhaps never get to with, you know, VC money or not, right? And does it mean it took 50 people to get Basecamp to the point where you no longer have to do the work you don't like doing?
Absolutely not. I mean, in many ways, at 50 people, I'm doing a lot more work that it's not that I don't like doing, but that it isn't my favorite thing to do, right? There's more work managing a company when you have 50 people than there is managing a company of 20 people. Now, there are some things that when it was just me and Jason and a couple of other people in the beginning, I had to do more stuff, right? Like these days, for example, I don't do any system administration. When we first got started, I mean, I was the only technical person, so I had to set up all the servers and manage them and do all that stuff. And Jason, for the first 3 years of Basecamp, answered every single customer support email. Neither of us spend the majority of our time doing either of those things anymore, which in some ways is sort of progress towards spending more of our times at the things that we're uniquely good at. As I said, me with programming and Jason with design. But it's been replaced with other things that we then need to worry about, right? But it's not that you have to do your favorite thing all the time. I don't think that that's a responsible or a possible thing to do, that whether that comes to work or it comes to home life, you can't just do your favorite things all the time. I think that's a hedonistic approach that's not very viable, and you're going to be essentially an asshole if you try to pursue that as a full-time strategy. But I fully believe that you can get to do your favorite things most of the time if you are so fortunate to be successful in what you do. I find a lot of people that I know or have talked to who on the surface should have all the options open for them to do their favorite things most of the time, but somehow they end up not doing that, right? They end up actually being miserable, even though they on paper have all this power to design their life to revolve in a way that they would truly enjoy. And I find that that's just sad, right? Like if you are so fortunate to get to a place where you can make these authentic choices about how your life should be, I mean, I find it to be an obligation that you do. So it's kind of just this balancing act of eating your vegetables, but also enjoying life.
Actually, I wonder, do you know why that's the case? Why people can't structure their life in, I mean, maybe less damaging way to themselves? Because I've met quite a few people who are now millionaires, and they too just snap back to work and really maybe they can think of something else to do with their life. Like, have you noticed a pattern?
Well, I've tried to investigate that question for quite a long time, which has led me down the path of philosophy, which really is the pursuit of how to live the good life. And in that pursuit, I found a number of philosophical disciplines that really resonated with me. One of them is Stoicism, which is this ancient Greek and Roman philosophy school that focuses a lot on our expectations and how the things that we think that are bad or good that happen to us are often bad or good because we had expectations of how they should be. And we have the power as conscious human beings to set different expectations. That doesn't mean that it's easy. In fact, it's very hard. And I think that there's a lot of expectations about how life should be or how things should turn out that people aren't consciously choosing. They're simply inheriting or they're adopting unconsciously, but that they end up running their lives in ways that aren't actually helpful to them. So the Stoic philosophy teaches people to examine that and re-examine that and changing their expectations and changing how they process events. And I find that to resonate very well with sort of my homegrown personal philosophy that I had developed just through my own experience. And this was basically a better, more refined, more articulate version of that had additional aspect I hadn't even considered. But because it reminded me of the thought patterns I had already had about how to live my life, it was just such an eureka moment where I went like, oh yeah, there were people 3,000 years ago who thought all this through and came up with some pretty compelling answers. And then they bottled it all up into an approachable philosophy of how to live the good life. So I think that's a great place to mine for those insights. The other philosophy that I've taken up more recently is the concept of existentialism. And that is a little bit less practical and perhaps more depressing view of the human condition, this notion that we are free to make our own choices. And that freedom is often kind of scary, if not outright despairing, that because we are free to make all sorts of choices that we perhaps think that we can't, right? Like you hear the saying all the time, I didn't have a choice. You always have a choice. I mean, it's an easy choice or whatever, but you do have a choice. And there's a lot of matters of how you design your life that are really dependent on making those conscious choices. So what I find is that a lot of people who end up unhappy when they should be happy is that they really haven't sat down and faced those questions, faced their own mortality, faced their own view of the world, and carefully examined whether what they're doing, the habits that they've formed, the choices that they're making, are getting them closer to what they truly want, which of course starts with figuring out what is it that you truly want, and how is it that you truly want to live. But taking the time to answer those questions, I think, is scary for a lot of people. And I was tweeting just a couple of days ago about the usefulness of the midlife crisis. The idea that the midlife crisis offers a lot of people the first encounter with their own mortality, with the notion that death is going to come one day for all of us. And when you look back at the life that you've led, are you happy with the decisions that you've made? And I think the midlife crisis for a lot of people represents a resounding no. They're not happy with the choices that they made, but they felt either that they had to make them or they just kind of did in an unconscious, inauthentic way where they went with the flow and this was what they were supposed to do, blah, blah, blah. And now they're facing that reality that those choices, they don't get to make them forever, right? Like they've already spent half of what there is to life. And is this really it? So the usefulness of that exercise is that even though the questions are scary and there might be despairingly scary, it is a choice to reset, or it is an option to reset. Now, the kind of stereotype in that case is that this is some middle-aged white dude, right, who goes out and buys a red sports car and divorces their spouse and finds someone half their age. And yeah, okay, that happens. And that kind of looks pathetic to a lot of people and not unjustifiably so. That doesn't mean that the underlying realization that what they had was not what they wanted isn't legit. It just probably means that the first place that they sought refuge in these material things or clinging on to youth or whatever, that's not what's going to save them, right? And once the midlife crisis plays through and they realize that these material or youthful clingings are not going to make them content and satisfied, then hopefully the real work of figuring out what it is then that can make you satisfied and content with your life begins.
I'm really happy to hear you say this because I think so many people take way too long to come to these conclusions and to reevaluate their life and ask the hard questions. And I do hope that our listeners will, at whatever age they're at, would ask themselves these questions. And specifically for me personally, I've lately started thinking about this concept of basically living your life in reverse, because I think for our parents, life was very different, where you went to work and you work. You know, one day you retired and then you try to enjoy life afterwards. But in today's day and age, with the way we work, there's really no reason to kind of maintain the same work environment, right? There's no reason you even need to work every year consecutively if you can afford to work differently.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's even sort of more than that in the sense that even if you do work full time, like for example, I work full time. Well, at least most of the year, I work about 40 hours a week. During the summer, we work 32 hours a week. We take Fridays off, but I do that knowing that that's how I want to spend 32 to 40 hours of my week. And I made that choice. But then I've also made the choice that beyond that, I don't want to just work, right? Like, I want to do something else. And that choice is not just something that Jason and I take as successful founders who don't have to work anymore. It's also the choice that we offer and encourage, if not outright enforce, for the employees that we have, that they need to, they should. They're better workers. They're better people. They will live better lives if they pursue other things than just work. And that it is possible to have a fulfilling career where you work and you're full time, and then also have very fulfilling pursuits outside of that career, and to kind of have both of those things. I think there's false dichotomies that have been repeated over and over again. And the latest is, for example, that work-life balance can't happen, that it's impossible to think of these terms, or it's even harmful to think of it in these terms, as it's some sort of struggle. And I see, like, I can't recognize that. I try exactly for that. I try exactly for a balance, that I want part of the scales filled up with work because it's intellectually stimulating. I get to work with wonderful peers. I get to realize myself through creation. I would not want to give up that. I think that's the pendulum swing that sometimes, at least in my mind, goes too far as a general prescription. For example, that living your life traveling all the time is this idyllic notion that should appeal to everyone. And if everyone had the choice to just travel the world continuously, that's how they would choose to live. Where I go, absolutely not. I go on a vacation for 2 weeks. I'm ready to do something else. Like, I don't want to live in a suitcase or in a series of hotels. And I've done exactly those two things for a large amount of the past 10 years, racing around the globe, long enough to realize that that's certainly not what I would want to do full time with my life. But it's a wonderful sort of part to have as one component of it. Yeah.
You wrote once in your post called Reconsider that people shouldn't just accept the definition of success because in a form that everybody else is cheering for success, but they have to figure it out on their own. So I'm curious, over the last 15 years that you've been doing Basecamp, how did you figure out your own metric for success, and how it's changed as you grew older, as you became a dad, as you became a millionaire and more successful?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the early conclusions I came to in life was the importance of intrinsic motivation. That I was not a particularly great employee, and I wasn't that particularly great of a general student either, because I wasn't motivated by extrinsic rewards very well. I wasn't motivated by grades, so that meant I had a few subjects in college and high school that I was really into and gave it my all. And then there were other topics, some at one time or another, and then something else at a different time, where I decided, you know what, I don't want to spend this year of my life doing math homework. I decided that my third year of high school, right? Like, do you know what? It's not that I don't really like math. I actually like math in some ways. But right now, there are things I would rather do than math homework. So what I'm going to consciously decide is that I'm going to get an F. I am going to fail this class. Even though I elected to take it myself, I regret that decision. And I'm just going to copy all my math homework. I'm going to find someone in my class who can allow me basically to copy all their homework, and I'm going to turn it in with alterations that make their homework worse, just enough to essentially not flunk out of high school, but no better than to get an F in the subject matter, right? And I didn't really give a shit, right? Like, it wasn't keeping me from doing the things that I wanting to do to make that choice. And then I got to spend all that time pursuing other things, like playing with the internet, pursuing my own projects online, and playing video games and all sorts of other things that I would rather do. And I mean, there's obviously tons of survivorship bias built into the next statement that comes here, but that worked out pretty well for me. It's not to say that's a general solution to everyone, that like, hey, if you just flunk your math classes, then everything's going to turn out peachy. Those things are not that well correlated. What is well correlated in my mind is discovering the power of intrinsic motivation, the things that you're motivated to do for the sake of doing them, right? Like I was extremely motivated to learn a lot about computers, to learn a lot about the internet, to learn about community building, to learn about leadership, all these disciplines that I'm now spending the majority of my time working on, and that the investment into those pursuits were well worth giving up other things for. So that realization, the power of intrinsic motivation, really drove me to look deeper into the whole topic of motivation and mastery. And those things are, of course, pretty tightly correlated, right? Like if you're heavily motivated to spend lots of hours of very dedicated training, you will eventually end up a master. Well, at least in most cases. And I'd say certainly so for most intellectual pursuits that are not sort of reserved to some sort of genius bracket, which I generally don't believe that most things are. And that meant that I was sort of on the chase. I was ready to adopt ideas such as finding flow, one of the very influential, or one of the most influential books I've ever read. Finding flow is all about breaking down these moments of happiness when you're completely engrossed in an activity that's just beyond your reach of your current abilities, and you get lost in time and space trying to chase that. And I found that once I could name that flow was a thing, and I was interested in getting more of it, I could set myself up and design my work and life to provide more of those opportunities.
It sounds like you've gone through quite a bit of reflection time throughout your career. But this is amazing to hear this, because I can almost feel the rage of A++ students who are working 80-hour days and probably achieved less success both financially and emotionally than you have.
I mean, I married one to some degree. My wife was a straight A student who got a 4.0 grade point average and pursued everything with extreme vigor in chase of, to some extent, extrinsic rewards. And I think that her experiences getting a bit disillusioned with that approach, and seeing others in her line of work, and I've seen the same, where you see someone who come out with all these credentials that society tells us are extremely important to chase, and then they come out without a compass of where they want to take that, can be absolutely tragic, right? You can end up with people who supposedly have it all, but are still completely miserable in what it is that they do. And then you can have other people who are not at all successful on any material, grade point average, college, whatever credential race that you're looking at, and they can be the happiest people that you meet. And I know who I'd rather be, right? I'd certainly rather live my life extremely content and fulfilled with the work and life that I was living, even if that meant at a much different end of the wealth scale, than end up living a life that didn't feel like it was mine, or one that I had chosen, but one that I had simply followed, even if that meant I could afford nice things. Of course, the ultimate overlap is when those two things meet, right? But for a lot of people, they don't necessarily. And if you do have to choose, I know which choice I'd rather make.
You know, given this philosophy on life, and you being a well-recognized sort of public figure and been very outspoken, and you spend a lot of time on Twitter, or not necessarily a lot of time, but you do express your opinions a lot. And by sheer virtue of being a startup founder, you definitely overlap with Silicon Valley circles, who pitch a very different narrative of working all the time, you know, for basically working a lot now so that later you can enjoy your life, if you ever get there. But I wonder, you know, what does it feel like to be you and engage in these discussions and still trying to break through this brick wall that just yells at you the opposite?
It's very fulfilling work, actually, I'd say. I've always had a streak of enjoying pushing and swimming against the stream. So just that activity on its own is enjoyable for me, especially when it is, of course, powered by a sense that I have some insights that other people could benefit from at least considering. And it's not so much that I seek, wish, or even think it is possible to convince most people that I debate on the topic of, let's say, overwork. But it is that I hope to sway some of the onlookers who view a debate like that to at least consider the fact that, hey, wait a minute, there are people who think differently. There are people who've been successful thinking differently. I don't have to just assume that the only path to success making a tech startup, for example, is working 120 hours a week. Here's a narrative, here's a story from someone who didn't do that, where things turned out pretty well. Let me at least listen to that argument. And then if I still choose to work 120 hours a week, then I will at least have made a somewhat informed choice. And then perhaps once I start regretting that choice somewhere down the line, I know which trail to pick up and explore once I'm ready for something else. So that kind of satisfaction that comes from sharing an alternate narrative and seeing that adopted by people who either tried the other version first and became disillusioned, or avoided that path and in either cases ended up happier on this other side, is very fulfilling. So, I mean, part of this is also just I'm working out my own thought process around these things, right? By sharing and thinking things through in public, I get to refine and hone my own arguments and my own internal debate about how things should be and how I should configure my own life. I mean, that's always a thing that's open for tinkering, and I try to do so continuously by both examining my own positions and views, but also by learning from others. And mostly the learning from others part comes from discovering these older sources of wisdom in terms of Stoicism or Existentialism or other writers over the millennia who've had wise things to say on these topics.
Do you think this focus on kind of living your own life and living life for yourself, the way you're doing it now, came in part because you grew up in Copenhagen and not in US?
I think it was easier to be receptive to these ideas in Copenhagen, no doubt. The Nordic model of a socially democratic state, I think, teaches you, even if you aren't ready to receive those teachings in the moment, which I certainly was not ready to receive all those teachings as I was growing up in Copenhagen, they're there, and they're there to draw on when you get exposed to what the alternative looks like, right? I was somewhat critical of the Danish system in all sorts of ways while I was living in Denmark, and aspirational towards the American entrepreneurial lore, for lack of a better word, for a long time. And then I moved to the US and I lived here for quite a long time. And then I became quite disillusioned with a lot of the established wisdom of why it is that America is so great. And I started to realize all the ways where the Nordic social democratic model really had gotten it right, and where it really had just made life better for vast numbers of people in society. And then seeing how hard life is for a lot of Americans, even Americans who are doing relatively well, how unsecure, how filled with anxiety over some fundamental basics that I never even thought to be worried about in Denmark, right? Things like health, education, and housing. Not that these things are not concerns everywhere, they are, but there are different categories of concern. The criticality of those concerns in the US system is at a completely different level than what it is for most Danes in the Danish system, for example. And it's not just Denmark. I mean, whenever I bring up Denmark, and I bring up Denmark because I was born and raised in Denmark and I spent 25 years there, people say, oh, well, that's easy because like 6 million people live there, right? Like that's the size of whatever American city that is. Well, I mean, it's not just Denmark, right? Like most of the EU have systems that are much closer to the Danish system on all the important basics of, let's say, health, education, and housing that are far removed from the American approach to those things. And I mean, there's how many people in Europe, right? 300 million. So again, this isn't to say that this is just some magic wonderland and like that everything was figured out and is figured out neither in Denmark nor in Europe, but just that on some of these societal questions, the European answers are simply fucking just better. And having lived in Denmark, the US, and Spain for long periods of time has given me an insight to evaluate that at a different level than if you've spent your entire life in the US or if you spent your entire life in Denmark or if you've spent your entire life in Spain. There's this saying of if you only know one country, you know no country. And I think there's a fair amount of truth to that.
Mm-hmm. No, that's wonderful because another guest on this podcast travels a lot with his daughter, and he's been saying that that's been one of the best ways to learn about the world for them is to go travel, basically take as much vacation time. And you were fortunate to grow up in different countries, and so have I. But a lot of people who were born in the U.S. Miss that opportunity, and it's extremely important just to see what else is out there, what's available for yourself. And
no doubt.
Yeah. One thing I want to cover real quick before we go any further is your first book. Well, not specifically, I guess, your first book, but the first book you guys did as Basecamp, which is Rework, because you guys were super popular for that one. It made rounds all over the planet, I guess. And I remember reading that book before I did my first startup and just thinking like, right on, these guys get it. Can you just really briefly cover that book and kind of tell us how you came to the idea of writing that particular book?
Sure. So the funny thing is Rework is actually our second sort of major book. Before Rework, we self-published a book called Getting Real in 2006, which included some of the same topics that we cover in Rework, but it was even more specific to our circumstances. It was basically like how to build a web app, right? And it got really specific into the nitty-gritty of that. Rework was a bit of a extraction from that book, that a bunch of people read Getting Real who weren't necessarily building software, but felt like a lot of the lessons that we shared in that book applied to their work as well. And it was funny. It's a bit of the same surprise we got with Basecamp, the product. When we first launched Basecamp, the product, we were just trying to solve our own problem, which was to have better communication, better project management around client services work, which was what our company was doing at the time, right? Design for hire. And then we realized, there's all these other people who are buying Basecamp to use it for all sorts of other things that are not client services related at all. And that's what happened with Getting Real, that we had all these lessons that we had accumulated building Basecamp and for both Jason and I working in the industry for longer than that we wanted to share and that we thought we had a different perspective on. So Rework was then sort of the first grand accumulation of those lessons that applied to more people more of the time. And we took basically 10 years of writing from both the Getting Real book and also years and years of blog posts and keynote speaks and so forth, and compiled that into one book with a bunch, I think 70 different short essays on individual topics such as hire when it hurts, interruption is the enemy of productivity, meetings are toxic, pick a fight, underdo your competition. These are some of the essay topics that we had in that book. So it was basically like, what is the value system? What are the principles? What are the practices that we use to run Basecamp in the way that we have? And in those, maybe there's some ideas for how you could change how you do things and see things differently. And at least, even if you're not going to do things like we're going to do, even if you're not going to give up press releases because we say press releases is spam, you get a different perspective on it, and you'll be more thoughtful when you employ techniques that seem like, oh, that's just the way everyone does things, right? Well, we provided on a bunch of those topics a different way of doing things, and this is saying you can be successful even if you don't do that, right? Even if you're only working 40 hours a week, for example. That didn't prevent us from building a wonderful company that we're proud of and still here and is massively profitable and has had the staying power and impact on the industry. Let us try to share some of those principles and values and techniques with you so that you can employ them on your own.
Did you guys know it was going to become a #1 bestseller, or was that a happy accident?
We knew that a bunch of the essays had really good pull because Rework was more of a remix than a original production, so to speak. It was basically like the greatest hits of the last 10 years. I often liken it to stand-up comedians who will, before they put together their HBO or I suppose these days Netflix special, they worked all of these jokes in many cases for years in clubs. And they know which one of them work and which one of them don't. So we knew we had a lot of winners in the material, but it's still a huge leap from that to selling more than 500,000 books around the world. I mean, yeah, you'd have to have bigger sort of self-confidence than even we do. And we have some pretty healthy self-confidence to think that, oh yeah, the first major book that we released with a publisher, of course, that's going to be a New York Times bestseller. And of course, it's going to sell more than 500,000 copies around the world. No, we didn't really know that. But it also, I mean, in some ways didn't matter, right? Like we weren't doing it for that. Rework would still have been a success to me if we had sold 1/10 the number of copies. Because in some ways I was writing the book for me. I was writing it to remind myself, to remind our own company of these values, principles, and ideas. We refer back to Rework all the times in ways where we have strayed, where we're like, hey, we know this, right? Like we know that we should ignore the details early on, which is another chapter in Rework. Yet we didn't in this case, right? I find that a lot of the most important lessons that you learn and you think are crucial, you can't just learn them once. You kind of have to learn them 2, 3, or 4 times before they truly sink in. So I was writing Rework for myself in many ways, and it's just added bonus that there were another 500,000 people around the world who also thought that the ideas were good, which comes back to that discussion we had about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, right? I did not tie my self-worth up to whether Rework was going to be a hit book or not a hit book. I was tying it up to, do I think it's a good book? And I thought, yeah, hell yeah, I think this is a good book. I would write essays that I wanted to read.
To be honest, I hope everyone listening to this podcast picks up a copy and reads it, because I remember it was one of the only few books that I was able to read from cover to cover in one setting. And I generally don't like reading books, but it was, I remember to this day, and I think the book came out, 8 years ago, give or take?
Yep,
right?
2010.
Yeah, it was so easy and exciting to read, and it just said everything that I was thinking at that point. So, to anyone who hasn't read it yet, they should definitely grab a copy and check it out. And I'll link to the book in the show notes. But actually, you guys have another book coming in this fall, right?
Yep. It's called It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work. And some of the topics are a continuation from Rework. It's probably the most direct sequel to Rework that we put out. Between the book we have coming out in a month and Rework, we published another book called Remote Office Not Required, which made the case for working remotely and gave people techniques and arguments for making that transition work. But that was more sort of targeted very specifically at the notion of remote work and how that enables all sorts of other good things. It doesn't have to be crazy at work, touches on a much broader scope of how, as we've just talked about on this podcast, that a lot of people get wrapped up in these performative notions of what work should look like, what busy should be, and that busy is good. And we try to take a hard swing at that and advocate for the calm company, essentially, that work doesn't have to be crazy. It can be calm, and it's better when it's calm. It's better when it's not 80-hour weeks or 120-hour weeks. It's better when it's not a packed schedules, when it's all super busy, when it's just meeting after meeting, when it's an overflowing inbox, when it's unrealistic deadlines, when it's an inability to sleep. And then even when you can sleep, you get to sleep not enough, when it's weekends that get swallowed up by work emails, when it's no time to think, when chat is just overwhelming you and drowning you out, and when it's all-nighters, and that you can turn work into a much calmer place by simply saying 8 hours a day is enough. 40 hours a week is plenty. I need time for myself. You need comfortably paced days. You need to use the weekends to recharge. You need to look at other techniques than just meetings for disseminating information or making decisions. Everything doesn't have to be a rush. You can work on a realistic schedule. And when you discuss things, it can be without making these knee-jerk reactions all the time. Basically just slowing things down and realizing you won't go slower, right? It's funny, in racing, we have this saying that slow is fast, that calm, careful inputs on the steering wheel actually drives the race car faster. And I think the same thing is true in business and at work, that if you're frantic and rushing around and you have 100 things and your hair is constantly on fire, you're not effective. You may be doing a lot of stuff, but it's not moving the right things forward. So we're making a pleaded argument for moving the right things forward and how to reconfigure work to be a place that doesn't feel like it's crazy all the time, right? And part of that is reconfiguring the practices of work, like how we have meetings or how we use chat or how we use email. But some of it is also revisiting the sort of goals and aspirations of work, that you don't have to be dominating your industry. You don't have to be crushing the competition. You don't have to have this war mentality or zero-sum approach to everything. And if you do, well, it's not really a surprise you get locked into this survivalist battle. But if you skip that and if you look things as adjective, right, that, hey, there can be and are many competitors to Basecamp. Isn't that wonderful? It means that people have choice. Basecamp is not the right fit for everyone. There's plenty of people who look at Basecamp and decide that they want something else. And there are plenty of people who look at other products that we tangentially compete against and say, like, no, I'd rather have Basecamp. The world would be poorer if we didn't have competitors or we weren't a competitor. It's not that we have to annihilate each other. So those are just some of the topics that we kind of cover in that book. And again, it's just like Rework. It's short. You'll be able to read it in a single setting. It's about the same length as Rework, which means that you can read the whole book end to end in 2-3 hours or something like that. I'd be surprised if you can swallow all the topics and challenges that we pose to you in those 2 and 3 hours, but at least the material itself is relatively short, and all the essays are just usually a couple of pages, and it draws heavily on our experiences running Basecamp for, well, close to 20 years for Jason's case. The company traces its roots back to 1999. I joined and started working with Basecamp in 2000, or started working with Jason in 2001. But these are not theoretical concerns. These are very practical concerns where we have actually hit the problems, tried to devise solutions. Some of the times the solutions didn't work, and then we tried some other ones. And these are the conclusions.
Sounds like another New York Times bestseller.
We'll see. We're going to try.
So it doesn't sound like it's going to be very hard to get there, to be honest. Because it's yet another book where it's just like, well, duh, like everybody should be doing this, or not doing the things you suggest not doing.
Right.
Somebody asked that, one of the show followers, but I'm actually curious, when you say, you're all about like not crushing the competition, and that like your product is good for somebody, you built a really good, really valuable product. And by the way, I've met some of the people who've been using Basecamp since basically the beginning of Basecamp, and they're still using it and they're still paying you money. It's pretty amazing, right? That somebody can be with a product for 10 plus years. But that said, where you guys gotten to, say, you just didn't quite discontinue, but I think you stopped sign up for Highrise.
Yes.
Which was a Slack-like product, right? That you guys been running for a long time.
It was actually a CRM. It was more of like a Salesforce-y kind of product. We did have another product that was kind of like Slack called Campfire, but we rolled that product into Basecamp several years ago. The one we just stopped new feature development on is called Highrise, which was sort of our second biggest product. And we had tried a bunch of different experiments with that. We had tried to have another team run it for a while, and we ended up not being happy with that after we'd given that a long period of time. We then considered whether we wanted to run it again, and ultimately decided, as we talked about in the beginning, that if we were to design Basecamp, what would we want to work on? And Highrise no longer fell within the sphere of things we were super excited to work on. And even though it was an amazing business, more successful than the vast majority of all SaaS companies that's ever been formed out there, that was still not enough for us to do it, right? Because we'd already reached the point where we don't have to do anything. So let's just work on our favorite things most of the time. And Basecamp remains a favorite things for us because the entire company uses it constantly. And the reason that we had built this other product, this Highrise CRM product, it was not compelling for us anymore to continue to pursue that. So we kind of decided, let's just make a choice and continue to support it for all existing customers who had it. That's one of the other core beliefs at Basecamp, that we cherish our legacy. We still operate a free piece of software called Tadalist that was launched in 2005 as a spin-off from Basecamp at the time. And I think we shut it down for new signups in like 2008 or something. And we still have like 1,000 people every day using that system. And that makes me proud and happy that we are the kind of company who will value a legacy such that a free product we launched we shut down to new signups more than a decade ago is still being operated, right? And we're not leaving those users in a lurch. And we're making the same promise to Highrise users. We basically call it, hey, we're here and we're going to run this until the last customer shuts out the lights, or it's the end of the internet, whichever comes first.
That's fascinating, and a true testament to the way you run your business, because most companies try to build more, acquire more,
yes.
right?
Yes.
Take over. And you guys have sold a job board, I believe, a year or two ago,
yes.
right? And you've shut down products, and it's only making you more successful because you're freeing up all this time to actually focus on the thing. It's fascinating.
And I mean, in some ways, it's not making us more successful. I think that is, if anything, the thing that I'm most proud of. The fact that we make these decisions and choices in the face of business realities, that the best thing for us, economically speaking, would absolutely be to keep Highrise, to examine the systems, to relaunch it. There's a huge market opportunity here. You could absolutely do that, and that would be great business, but it wouldn't be our business. And we're not doing business just for business, right? We're not doing it just for the money. We've already reached the point of enough, which is another key argument that we make in It Does Have to Be Crazy at Work. Knowing when is enough, when you're liberated to make your own authentic choices about what you want to pursue, is absolutely critical. I'm not going to tell you like what is enough. But if it's never enough, well, that's probably not that healthy.
That's a great place to leave work and switch to your life. And you mentioned that you're a race car driver. And I think a lot of people want to know more about that and how you came to be a race car driver and what it gives to you. And also people ask for a garage tour, but we're on the podcast. But as much as you can tell us about your collection, I'd love to know, if you don't mind.
Sure. So first of all, I'd say saying you're a race car driver sounds like that's your identity. I probably shouldn't say that because it isn't. I should say I drive race cars because I like it and it's fun. But I'm not a race car driver in that sense. It almost implies that this is what you do for a living. It's not. I wouldn't want to be a race car driver even if I could. That is simply not a lifestyle that I find appealing, to be blunt about it. But I do like driving race cars, and I do like driving race cars because it is such an immediate way of accessing flow, as we talked about, this state where you're constantly on the cusp of trying to get a little better. You're getting immediate feedback from the system that you're working with in terms of lap times and whether you improved or you didn't. And there's enough sort of engrossment in the activity, trying not to crash, trying not to get into a serious accident, that it almost automatically commands your entire attention, right? So that has been a lot of fun, and I've really had a great time doing it over the past 10 years or so. I sat in my first race car in 2007. I got my driver's license at 25 in 2005. So kind of I made short work of the gap between getting my driver's license and starting to race cars. But that is then also
maybe it's
that has also then flowed into a general appreciation of cars. I like cars and I like watches because both of them have this sense of practical art to them and craftsmanship to them. That there's just the kind of people who work on products like that, the amount of minutia and layers you can dive into is just fascinating and fun. And I found that with both watches and with cars that I really just enjoy that. Again, through the fortunes of Basecamp, I've been #blessed to get to enjoy some of the finer specimens of both categories. And when it comes to cars, just had some really great experiences driving cars on the open road. For me, especially convertibles, I'm a big sucker for convertibles. There's just something about being in touch with the environment and engaged in this activity that you can kind of put on autopilot when you're just driving on the road, yet you still have to keep your wits about, and it's just awesome. And I also just looking at them, right? Like they're the best examples of both cars and watches. As I said, they're works of art, and you can appreciate them even if you're not sitting in it, even if it's just standing still in your garage. And so hobbies.
It's a good hobby, albeit a bit of expensive hobby. But I suppose once you start winning races, it pays for itself.
Not at all. Not in the slightest sense of the word. There's no money to be made in racing, only money to be lost. One of the jokes in racing is if you want to make if you want to make a small fortune in racing, you should start with a large fortune, because you will end up with a small fortune by the time you're done. It is just ludicrously expensive, to put it mildly. And a lot of that is because it's a very labor-intensive sport, right? Like I'm going to a race this weekend in Laguna Seca up north near San Francisco, actually. And to put the two cars that we have on the team on the track, I mean, that's a huge operation. That's the company behind that, with all the people who show up on that weekend, will be as large as Basecamp. Of course, that's expensive. And I mean, that's kind of just how it is, right? But it also feels like, well, I mean, of all the things you could spend your time and money on, pursuing a sport that employs a bunch of people and has a bunch of fans who are interested and get enjoyment out of that. I mean, there's certainly worse things you could do. There's certainly also better things. I'm not going to hold it up as some pious pursuit. No, I do it because it's fun and because I can. And that's, really the sum of it.
You've quoted this quote from, I believe, Coco Chanel before, that the best things in life are free and the next best things are very, very expensive.
Yes.
Does that mean this racing deal is the second best thing?
Yes. And I think I was just thinking about this a couple of days ago, where I was working on some new software at Basecamp, and I was going like, I don't know what I'd rather want to be doing right now, but it's not even driving a race car, right? I'm literally having more fun. I'm being better stimulated, and it's more rewarding to work on this intellectual pursuit to try to get this domain model just right for this piece of programming than it is to spend time in a race car. So for me, as kind of like the pursuits that I can choose to have, programming in Ruby, that's one of those free things, right? Like, all that takes is time, and it's number one. And then below that, you have the sort of very expensive things that are in second place. But the distance between those two things is very far. I could give up race car driving tomorrow, and I'd be like, okay, well, I'll play PlayStation then, right? Like, I'm a big fan of Wipeout and Forza Motorsport and Horizon and all sorts of other racing games on the computer. And you know what? It's not actually that big of a step down compared to the fact that, like, I could not imagine giving up programming, right? Like, that would be a really substantial and deep felt loss in a way that giving up a hobby like driving race cars just wouldn't. And there's a lot of things that are like that. And I think getting exposed to those things is a healthy way of putting them into perspective, because I find a lot of people going, oh man, it must be the greatest thing ever to be able to drive a race car or to own this or that and that car or whatever, you know. And you want to go like, you know what? Yeah, I'm not going to lie. It's pretty sweet, but that's pretty much the extent of it. It's not going to fulfill you. It's not going to define you, and all the problems in your life are not going to disappear. And you're not all of a sudden going to be transformed to this happy person just because you get to be exposed to these experiences. It's not. It doesn't work like that. And that's not even that it doesn't work for me like that. I've never seen anyone where it works like that before. So I think kind of getting exposed to some of these things is a great way of accurately assessing their true value. And I'd say that their true value is far, far below what most people have this fantasy that they are, which gets back to the point we started with, right? Like trying to figure out what are you doing in life and why, and asking the hard questions. They don't have easy answers like, oh, just buy a Lamborghini.
Mm-hmm. You know, from everything you say and you've written, you don't come across as a very risky person. Maybe more like, you know, honest and analytical, but I wouldn't say like you wouldn't jump off a cliff without a parachute.
I'm extremely risk averse. Extremely risk averse. That goes both for business and hobbies and all sorts of things. And I think that's one of the other narratives that I'm keen to dissemble whenever I have the opportunity, that entrepreneurs or race car drivers for that matter, they're these extreme risk-seeking individuals who only get a high in life from basically just hanging on the edge between total glory and total destruction. I am not that person in the least. All my entrepreneurial decisions have been made with, in Denmark we have this saying of with belts and suspenders at the same time. Very cautious and very considered, and always looking at the downside risk of like, you know what, the odds are that this will probably fail. Let me set myself up in such a way that when it does, or if it does, that's not devastating. And I've tried to do the same thing with hobbies. I mean, people look at race car driving and think like, oh wow, that's really dangerous. And I mean, it's not that it's without danger, but modern race cars have gotten extremely safe compared to what they used to be. I mean, if you were a race car driver in the 60s, I mean, that was tantamount to having some amount of a death wish, right? But there's all sorts of things that I, for example, don't want to do. Like, I don't drive motorcycles, and it's not because I don't think driving a motorcycle would be a lot of fun. As I said, I love convertibles, and like driving a motorcycle is like the ultimate convertible. But I've never met a person who drives a motorcycle who don't have a story of a near-death experience, either personally or of a friend or something else, and just go like, you know what? I don't need that level of risk in my life. I could just go on a racetrack and stick something with four wheels on the track, and okay, maybe you can have an accident, and I've had a few, and some of those accidents can be terminal, and they have been for people I've known, but overall the risk profile is acceptable.
This brings me nicely to your family and your kids. Being a risk-averse, still a race car driver, how does it work at home? You know, like, how do you go and race your car knowing that there could be a potentially fatal accident?
How do I go about living my life in general, knowing that there could be a potentially fatal accident, right? Like, people slip in the shower all the time, or more importantly, they drive on the public roads and become one of the 36,000 people who die every year in the U.S. in an automobile accident, right? We still find ways to go on with our lives and not be paralyzed by fear, simply because you've made a conscious choice, right? Like, I've looked at race car driving and made a conscious choice, like, this is a risk I'm willing to make. And part of that is because living life is not just about making it, the odds of being it as long as possible. That's not the game, right? I think the game is to have it be worth living. And for me, part of that answer for it to be worth living is to pursue things like race car driving. And then I balance that off with being extremely healthy about a lot of other things that are way more likely to actually kill you than driving a race car. I don't smoke, I don't drink, I keep in shape, I breathe fresh air, I get lots of sleep, I eat healthy, I drink clean water, I go for walks in nature. There are all these sort of more mundane approaches to how to live your life that will increase your mortality that don't mean giving up on things that you really enjoy, like driving a race car. And those for me are much easier sacrifices to make, that like eating healthy or breathing fresh air or exercising or so on and so forth. Like, that's not like, I can combine reducing risks in those areas that I'm not going to hopefully die from an early heart attack, from obesity or diabetes, or from particle matter filling my lungs, or whatever else have you. I'm going to take my risks in other ways. So it's not about so much eliminating risk as it is about balancing it.
Next thing you know, one day we found out you fell in the sewer.
It happens all the time, right?
But to be honest, I was asking this question about a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, because I think when you become a parent, at least for us and for a lot of our friends, you feel like you need to bubble wrap your kids and maybe yourself as well. And things become very dangerous, very mundane. Things become perceivably dangerous, right? What if something happens? And it's great to hear you say these things, how just, maintaining healthy living is probably more beneficial to your life than avoiding slightly higher risk situations.
And also, I mean, when it comes to kids in particular, that is the topic I do care about trying to overprotect. And like, that is not the goal, right? Again, the goal of living is not to make it as long as possible. It is to make it as full as possible and as rewarding as possible. And part of making it as full as rewarding as possible includes taking reasonable risks. And unfortunately, I think particularly in the US, people have become extremely risk averse to things that are extremely unlikely to happen, right? I don't know if you follow the thing on free range kids. the notion that kids at reasonably young ages, they can kind of go about their business on their own, as I did when I grew up, and as most people did who are 40 years or older when they grew up. And these days, it's a complete freak out. It's almost a sort of police action if you see an 8-year-old walking down the street by themselves, right? Even though there's never been lower rates of kidnapping and violence and other risks to these kids. Versus if you look at the risks, for example, of suicide, they just keep going up, right? And I feel like oftentimes parents are not attuned actually to making careful risk analysis, because they look at these things, oh, what if my kid got kidnapped? And not, what if my kid ended up miserable from feeling like a prisoner who's being escorted from cell to cell all the time with a supervisor or guardian, and then end up being so miserable that they kind of make the ultimate choice and kill themselves. I mean, that's, of course, two kind of extremes out there, but I feel like that's a far more credible risk. Suicide is already the, I believe, second leading cause of death for teenagers, right? It's not getting fucking kidnapped by someone. It's succumbing to the pressures and anxieties of the life that they're living, which in part includes this bubble wrap approach and this zeal to eliminate all physical risk while completely ignoring all the mental risks. And I feel like that's an incredibly poor trade.
So is there anything you guys doing with your wife to enable this free range childhood for your children?
A lot of it is just, I mean, letting kids hurt themselves. For just take one simple example, right? Like, let them crawl on some rocks that kind of look dangerous and they could hurt themselves. I mean, short of them actually putting themselves in a position where they're going to kill themselves from something, it's not a bad thing for kids to experience on themselves, like the consequences of their actions. And it's the best teacher in many ways. Another example of this is my wife and I care greatly about eating healthy, right? But there's ways to invite your kids into that eating healthy world that doesn't go through, oh, we're going to ban all sugar, for example, right? There are all sorts of bad things about sugar, but you know what? I ate a fuck ton of sugar growing up, and so did a lot of other kids. And yes, some of them ended up addicted to that and getting diabetes and so on, but a lot of them also didn't, right? Like, let's perhaps keep things a little bit in perspective and just eat some fucking candy sometimes, right? Like, that's not going to be the end of the world. So I feel like trying to endow our kids with as much autonomy as is reasonable, and sometimes even a little bit unreasonable, I'd rather do that and rather focus on that than sort of trying to protect them from all these long-term dangers, and which they're not really going to believe in anyway, right? Like, as soon as they're old enough to decide for themselves, if what they were conditioned to do was basically just, you can't do this or you can't do that, what's the first thing they're going to do once they have the power to do it? Of course it's this and that, right? Of course it's the thing you said they couldn't do. So that's another angle of it.
It's very refreshing, and hopefully more people will pick up on this and follow along and let their kids be free. But yeah, here you have to basically give them a slip that says, you know, I'm a free range child, so please don't like take me to a police station if I'm just walking home by myself.
Fucking ridiculous is what it is.
Yeah, if I ever make Red Dad Shorts, it's going to say, just eat some fucking candy. You know, have you had any really profound experiences that shaped you as a dad? You said your oldest is 6, right? So there's been quite a bit of time now.
I've certainly had some influences. I've been heavily influenced by a writer and educator called Alfie Cohen, that has written a bunch of books, including The Myth of the Spoiled Child, Punished by Rewards. Punished by Rewards in particular has been very influential, not just on my relationship with parenthood, but also as a leader and as a human, of seeing sort of that split between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation over and over again being misused and harming to kids, right? Like a lot of kids, or a lot of parenting paradigms go on the order of like, oh, if we introduce this point system, I can get my kids to do what I tell them to do, and I can get them to sit still and so on. And like, okay, maybe that's true, and that sounds like a great way of growing the next batch of authoritarian supporters. But you know what? I don't think that's a very healthy approach. A lot of the times, it seems like parents are unreasonably obsessed with obedience, and educators too, to the point where like you should realize that kids are autonomous, independent beings, and they have their own priorities and they have their own motivations, and oftentimes they are in opposition to yours. That does not make them bad, right? Yes, it may make it inconvenient and may make it frustrating, and it may do all sorts of things. And you may wish that your kids would just do as you told them to, but that doesn't mean that they should, or that it's better for them if they did. In many ways, it's much worse if they do, right? And I try to protect and nurture that healthy sense of distrust of authority and rebellion. I mean, it's hard not for me not to smile when my oldest son says, like, why do I need to do that just because you told me to? You know what? That's a pretty fucking good argument, right? Why does anyone need to do anything just because someone told them to? No, come up with some real arguments. And you know what? Oftentimes those arguments fall apart because the argument is, that would be slightly more convenient for me. And you're like, well, fuck you. That's how I think, right? Like I've tried to sort of have the dialogue. Like if I was my kid, then I would go like, yeah, that's not a fair argument, right? You're basically just forcing me to do shit because you can. What a crappy relationship that is. And again, I mean, that's a little bit on the point that sometimes there are times where you just need to get in the fucking car and go. But those times are far fewer and further between than most people seem to realize.
No, I wholeheartedly agree with all of this. So I'm just smiling from ear to ear right now listening to this because it's awesome. And we've also been in those situations, and it's really hard because as a parent, I think you encourage that rebellious behavior and to question everything. But then when you get questioned, you're like, oh, this is not a good time.
Absolutely. Which is, of course, that it's the best time, right? Because if you only do parenting when it's easy, like what kind of parenting is that, right? And then I'd rather take my, like, this is frustrating. And I'm no saint in that regard. I can get extremely frustrated with both the kids at times when they're being what looks to me as being unreasonable, right? Until I get a moment to breathe and think like, do you know what? They're their own persons. And what's unreasonable to me is often completely reasonable to them. And if I put myself in their little shoes, which particularly with my oldest one, I now can, because I have all sorts of memories from when I was his age. So it's not that hard for me to enter into that mindset and think like, yeah, fuck you, right? I'm not going to do what you say just because you told me to. And so it's kind of the balancing act of tolerating that frustration while at the same time encouraging the independence and protecting the intrinsic motivation. And allowing a kid to make mistakes, to say mean or even hurtful things somewhat in a safe environment where they can kind of act out those roles as they learn to hopefully do less of that stuff and not be a draconian asshole who punishes willy-nilly on whims like some tyrannical king. I think that's unfortunately a role that is very deceivingly easy for parents to fall into. That like, hey, you do what I say because I told you to. That, I mean, the number of times kids around the world have heard that statement is just heartbreaking. I think that to me is the most totalitarian statement of all of parenthood, right? You're going to do this because I told you to, not because it's a good idea, not because I have reasonable arguments, but just because I told you to, right? That's absolutism in its most absolute form. And that is an absolutely fucking terrible way of parenting or dealing with anyone, right?
No, it definitely isn't. I think so many people grow up that way, thinking that way, or being taught that way, that when they become adults, they can't break through and unlearn that.
Yes. That is sort of the tragic of how sort of abuse sometimes replicates, right? I've had this discussion on Twitter a couple of times of, I believe it's still legal in the US to spank your kids, which is, to me, is just fucking mind blowing, right? Like, what a fucking perverted medieval approach to parenting, and something that thankfully was outlawed in, I think, the 70s in Denmark. Maybe it was even earlier, maybe it was a little later. Either way, it is outlawed now. I think it's a complete travesty than it is in the US, that you just reinforce the idea that parents have this total dominion over their kids. They can already tell them like what to do, and now they can also physically punish them for being disobedient. Fuck that.
I could probably talk about this for hours, but I do have one question that I must get out of the way. The question is from my wife. And it's given everything you've done and how you kind of came to be a wealthy person by hard work and sometimes kind of happy accident, right? Where you met the right people, or say you went to school, but you taught yourself to program. Now, knowing what you know about the world and the risks and opportunities, how are you going to teach your kids about money?
Yeah, that is not a easy question, because the easy, I think, answer, the stock answer for anyone rich is like, oh, I'm going to teach them the value of money, right? I guess in like, they shouldn't think that they just have this or whatever, or the myth that this is how you end up with spoiled children. If they just think that if they have no concept of money and they can just pursue all these things, buy things willy-nilly, then they'll end up terrible people. I'm pretty skeptical of that whole idea. I think that most rich kids that fall under the stereotype of spoiled rich kids end up being assholes because their parents are fucking assholes, not because of the money. Now, the other thing of that is it doesn't help to pretend, right? Like, how disingenuous is it of me to spend all sorts of ungodly sums going racing and then going to my kid, no, you can't have this $15 toy that you want. Because of what? Because of the money? Are you fucking kidding me? Like, that's not a congruent relationship with money, so to speak. So I don't think I really have the final answer there, except if to say that I'd wish to de-emphasize the value of money. Now, there's a line to that, and you should be respectful of that, and you shouldn't grow up to be completely oblivious of that. But I think most of the times people overcorrect and they overteach about money, at least in the sense of the value of money, right? That the value of money gets placed on this pedestal as this crowning thing that we should all be focusing most of our attention on getting. What a fucking impoverished life that is, right? I'd rather teach all sorts of other lessons about how to live the good life that are not about like, how can I make the most money or whatever. And so I don't have a final answer there. I just have some directional clues that I don't want to be incongruent. So I can't sort of be all uptight about a $15 toy that the kid wants, while at the same time spending many times that pursuing my own toys. That's a good way of growing assholes, I think, because I think a kid can't see that or can't realize that you're being a completely hypocritical asshole about that. Of course they can. And of course they're going to draw their conclusions on that. And then at the same time, in some ways, devaluing money, right? And that is a luxury. I will 100% sort of cop to that. Most people do not have the luxury of devaluing money, right? Because there's real bills and whatever to pay for it. But if you do have that luxury, do, right? Because I find that the opposite is often true, that it's rich parents who end up overemphasizing the value of money and attaching all sorts of other meritocratic ideals to it. Oh, we are virtuous and good because we have a lot of money. And the people who work really hard they end up making a lot of money. Oh, for fuck's sake, shut the fuck up. Like, that's not how the world works, right? And I mean, I even cringe a little bit when you say in the intro to this, like, oh, you worked really hard and then you were also a bit lucky. You know what? I didn't work very much harder than hardly anyone, right? If you define hard as number of hours put in, for example, plenty of people work way harder than me in way harder circumstances. Some of that was that the work I did ended up being valuable to a lot of people in a marketplace approach, and that's how current economic system rewards people. And let's just be fucking honest about that. Let's not try to wrap it up in this meritocratic myth that, like, the people who have the most money have the most money because they are virtuous and good and that they worked really hard. There's an endless number of people who work insanely hard and do not have any money at all. So don't give me that crap. Anyway, these are, as you can hear, these are not topics that I have fully fleshed out a completely coherent philosophy on, even for myself. So it's a work in progress.
But I love the openness to talk about it publicly and honestly without trying to sugarcoat it or pretend like you know all the answers. So all things considered, how's been a dead so far?
It's been wonderful. I mean, it's hard to actually imagine not having done that. And it's very easy to imagine a great deal of regret if it had not happened, right? Of all the things that I've done, where it's like, oh, if I hadn't done that, I would have looked back with regret. This certainly ranks very high, if not at the top of the list. And that's saying with the notion that, like, when my wife kind of first brought up the topic, I wasn't necessarily the most enthusiastic about the idea, at least not in the concrete, maybe in the abstract sense of one day, sometime, but not in the concrete of like, hey, shortly. But I'm very glad that she convinced me otherwise, and I wouldn't have it any other way. And I think it's a extremely material part of what makes me appreciate life, my own life, the life of humanity in general, to have your own offspring. And it's been incredibly rewarding to just watch humans that I had a part in making, and I can see strains of my DNA playing out, kind of growing up and becoming their own persons. That's just a remarkable part of the human condition that I fully understand it's not for everyone, and I wouldn't want to. I'm certainly not one of these people that's like, oh, why don't you have kids? You should really have kids. There's a lot of people who probably are more unhappy with their kids than they are without, and that is something that very much is a personal choice to make, but one I'm extremely pleased with having made.
If you like what you heard, the best compliment you can give us is by sharing the show with your friends and letting people know what you think by leaving a review on iTunes. Thank you for listening. This has been The Rad Dad Show. See you next time.